Hi, I'm Pastor Adam Strode.
And I'm David Knoll, and we are Disciples United. Today we're going to be covering the topic of hell. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about why hell is necessary and how a loving God could send someone to hell. Oftentimes when we're talking to people about the Bible, we hear this objection of hell, and it goes something like this. I'm not the most perfect being or the most loving being, and I could never send someone somewhere eternally to punish them for something they did to me. So how could a loving God do that to someone else as well? So Adam, how is it that someone starts to answer a question like this?
Well, it's not an easy question to answer, but it is something that we have to answer as Christians. And I feel that oftentimes this is a question that gets marginalized or swept under the rug. We sort of dismiss it as unimportant, or we just say, well, that's the way that it is. But it is something that we have to examine, and it is something that we have to answer. It is a valid question because on the surface, it does seem to be an apparent contradiction in God's character and nature. We know that God is loving. We're told that very explicitly in 1 John chapter 4, verse 8. And yet the question arises, if he is loving and we know that he is, how is it possible that hell still exists? Now the way that we tackle this, the way that we handle this objection is by understanding an essential truth about God's character and nature. And that's that although God is loving, he also has a host of other attributes. God is a being that is multifaceted in nature. Yes, he is loving, but he's also kind, and he's also merciful, and he's also just, and he's also wrathful. He is perfect in all of these ways, but he also has to be consistent within his own character and nature. God, being honest, cannot do something that is dishonest. God, being just, cannot do something that is unjust. And it's his justice in particular that we have to look at when we're examining sort of this conflict between God's love and hell. So we're going to look at his justice. Now it's important to realize that God is in fact a just being. We're told in Isaiah chapter 30 verse 18, it says, "Yet the Lord longs to be gracious to you. He rises to show you compassion, for the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are those who wait for him." Isaiah 51 verses 4 through 5 say, listen to me, my people, hear me, my nation. The law will go out from me. My justice will become a light to the nations. In Isaiah 61 verse 8 it says, "For I, the Lord, love justice." And the last one I'd like to read is out of Revelation chapter 20 verses 11 through 12. It says, "Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works by the things which were written in the books." I think this is perhaps the best verse to end on because it shows very succinctly this idea that God, being just, is going to sit in judgment over those who transgress the law. And although he loves us desperately, he has to be consistent with his character and he has to be consistent with his justice. Because he is just, he cannot do something that is unjust. And because we have sinned, because we have transgressed, he has got to stand, he is obligated by his nature to stand in judgment over us.
So, especially when we talk about hell, we seem to hear this term sin used oftentimes. And I think it's a good idea to kind of clarify what that means. So what is sin?
Sin in the New Testament comes from a Greek archery term, which essentially means to miss the mark. And so the idea that the New Testament authors were trying to sort of get across is this idea that if you were standing in an archery range and you were shooting down range at a target, if you missed the bullseye by an inch or you missed the bullseye by a mile, it didn't matter so long as you missed the bullseye. In this case, the bullseye is God's perfect law. It's his perfect morality. It's his perfect nature. It's his perfect character. And if you do anything that is outside of God's perfect moral nature or perfect law, then you have transgressed. John says as much in 1 John chapter 3 verse 4. He says, "Everyone who sins breaks the law." In fact, sin is lawlessness. And this fits very nicely with our ideology of God being this just God, because as a just God, he also has a perfect law upon which he judges. Now, it's important for us to understand that this is something that impacts everybody. Because we're told in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, that all have sinned and have fallen short of the glory of God. So this is something that we all need to be concerned about because it's something that's going to uniformly impact every single person that walks the face of this earth. There's no one that can stand and say, "Not me. I haven't sinned. I haven't transgressed God's law." Because by making that statement, you have become and made yourself a liar. And again, you stand guilty of transgressing God's law. Now, it's also important that we understand what exactly the consequence is for breaking this law. Now, we understand in our own society that when you break the law, there is an appropriate reaction and an appropriate consequence. If I speed and I get caught, I get a speeding ticket. If I murder someone, I'm either going to go to prison or I'm going to, get the death sentence. But we understand that when you transgress the law, there is an appropriate consequence that comes with it. God, being just, also tells us what the appropriate consequence is for transgressing his perfect law, for breaking his perfect moral character and nature. And he tells us right from the very beginning. This is in Genesis chapter 3, verse 3, when God is talking to Adam and Eve. He says, "You must not eat from the fruit, or from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." And that is the consequence of sin. That is the consequence of transgressing the law, that you will die. This is reiterated by Paul in Romans chapter 6, verse 23. He says, "For the wages of sin is death." So when we sin, when we transgress God's law, the consequence is that we die. But that is not the only consequence, because although that's a physical component, there's also a spiritual component. And the spiritual component of transgressing God's law is separation from him. This is probably best seen in Isaiah chapter 59, verse 1, where it says this, "Surely the arm of the Lord is not too short to save, nor his ear too dull to hear. But your iniquities have separated you from God." And so it's this idea that God desperately longs to save, and he has the power to save. In fact, he even leans his ear in to hear us. And yet because of our sin, because of our transgression, and because God is obligated by his justice to impose and judge and stand in judgment over us, we have been separated from him. And essentially that's what hell is. Hell is defined as a place where God is not, and that's the reason why it's so terrible. So when we sin, not only do we die, but the other part of this consequence is that we are eternally separated from God.
So what we seem to see is that if we sin, we actually deserve to go to hell. But then isn't there something that we can do? Can't we follow this law perfectly so that we're not going to stand in judgment of hell?
And that's a good question. Now, to answer the first part, do we deserve hell? Yes, absolutely. Because, like it says in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And just to bring it home, no, there's nothing that you can do to make yourself right before God. And that's one of the quintessential differences between Christianity and the other sort of world religions. Because in the other world religions, we see this striving to make ourselves right with God. It's if you pray enough, or if you make enough pilgrimages, or if you meditate enough, or etc., 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 that eventually you can do something to make yourself right with God. And yet God very clearly says, no, that's not the way it is. There's nothing that you can do to make yourself right with me. The psalmist says in Psalm 130, verses 3 through 4, "If you, Lord, kept a record of sins, Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, so that we can with reverence serve you." Paul also talks about this, trying to make yourself right with God by upholding the law in Romans chapter 3. He says, "Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law we may become conscious of sin." So the purpose of the law is not to bring us life. It's not this thing that allows us to make ourselves right with God. Rather, it's this thing that condemns us and shows us that there's nothing that we can possibly do on our own to get right with God. And yet he will provide a way.
So if there's nothing that we can do, no way we can actually follow this law perfectly, how is it that anyone gets into heaven?
And it's a good question. Now, the things you have to understand up front is that God does not desire people to go to hell. In fact, Jesus tells us very clearly in Matthew chapter 25, verse 41, that hell was not even intended for mankind. It was intended for Satan and his fallen angels. So hell is sort of this fallback, this place of separation from God that people will go, but it was never intended to be that way. In fact, God's will, the desire of his heart is that no person should ever go to hell. We're told in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9 this, "Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." And in Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 10 through 11, it says, "Son of man, say to the Israelites, this is what you are saying. Our offenses and sin weigh us down, and we are wasting away because of them. How can we live? Say to them, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. Turn from your evil ways. And so what these verses clearly illustrate is that God's desire is not to see us in hell. He loves us. He's a God of love and he's a God of compassion. He's not vindictive and he's not petty and he's not sitting up there saying, oh yeah, I'm really going to show you. That's not his desire. His desire is that you would turn away from wickedness and that you would turn to him. And because it's the desire of his heart, and because he is loving, and because he's compassionate, he's also made it very, very, very easy to get into heaven. But it's not by your own works. I think the best way to look at this is an analogy that I like to call the just judge analogy. And this is how it goes. Let's say that we have an 18-year-old kid, and he's in his car, and he's driving along, he's doing 55 and a 25, and it's a school zone. And a police officer pulls him over, gives him a ticket, he goes into court, and the judge says, son, did you really do this? Did you do 55 and a 25 in a school zone? And the kid says, yeah, you know what, I did do that. I wasn't thinking, and, I made a mistake. And the judge says, well, the consequence for doing 55 and a 25 in a school zone is either a $10,000 fine or a year in jail. And the kid says, wow, I don't have $10,000. I can't possibly pay that on my own. But I don't want to do a year in jail either. Now let's add a new component to this analogy of ours. Let's say that the judge also happens to be the boy's father. Now let's also assume that this father, this judge, loves his son very much. Would it be just for him to say, well, son, you did 55 and a 25 in the school zone, maybe you endangered some lives, but I love you desperately. And although the consequence is technically a $10,000 fine or a year in jail, because I love you, I'm just going to pretend it didn't happen and I'm going to sweep it under the rug. We all know, from a human perspective, that that would be a sham of justice. And God, being perfectly just, could never do such a thing. God has to stand in judgment over us, and if the consequence of our sin is death and separation from him, then it must be so. But let's say this. Let's say that that judge were to take off his robe and to come and stand beside his son and say, look, son, I know that you don't have $10,000, and I know that you don't want to spend a year in jail, and you know what? I don't want you to spend a year in jail because I love you. But I have $10,000. I'm a judge. I make all kinds of money, and I am willing to pay the price that you couldn't pay for yourself if only you're willing to accept it. That is essentially what God has done for us. This year in jail, this price that we could not possibly pay, this separation from him, is the thing that we deserve because we are guilty. But God, because he is loving, has stepped down in the guise and the manifestation of Jesus Christ to pay the fine that we couldn't possibly pay for ourselves. He paid that fine on the cross. He paid it through his blood. In fact, God even established very early on the way in which it was going to be done. In Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11, it says, for the life of a creature is in its blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. And so Jesus' blood, the blood of God himself, has paid and redeemed us from our sins and provided us with an opportunity to go to heaven, provided us with an opportunity where we do not have to be separated from God. And this is the way that God reconciles hell. He reconciles his justice with his love, because not only is he being just, but he's being just, he's paying for the crime, but he's also doing it in a loving way so that we can be redeemed and we can be atoned. What this really comes down to is the kid. Because the kid in our analogy can either say, hey, you know what, Dad, thank you very much for the $10,000. I'm going to take you up on your offer. You can say, hey, you know what, I appreciate it, but I'm an adult and I can do what I want, and I did the crime and I'm going to do the time. We are free will beings, and God respects our free will very much. It is his will that not a single person should perish, that no one should go to hell at all. But he loves us enough and he respects us enough as free will creatures to say, if that's what you want, I will give it to you. I think it's best sort of summed up in Romans chapter 6, verse 16. Paul says this, don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey? Whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. So you see, there's two roads before us in offer, the gift of grace. God says, what you deserve is hell, but what I'm going to give you through my love is grace, and I will grant you heaven. There's two roads before you, and you get to choose. And if you choose life, I will gladly give it to you. But if you choose death, I will respect you enough to honor your choice. And that's what it is. Hell is a choice. Every single person that goes there because they chose it over righteousness, because they chose it over life. And I think that's kind of it.
All right, I think we covered a pretty tough topic today. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and leave them below in the comments section, or you can send those questions to us directly. Also, if you guys need help following these podcasts as we start to release them going forward in the future, go ahead and subscribe up on the top of the screen here. And as always, click the like button down below. Thanks so much, guys, for watching once again, and God bless.
God bless.